Good morning, everybody. Many thanks for coming along this morning. My thanks also to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for hosting us here. Of course, one of the founding members of this society was Adam Smith, and his thoughts on the subject we're speaking about today are worth reflecting on. Adam Smith observed that the subjects of every state ought to contribute towards the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. Now, that might seem like a statement of the obvious, but it goes to the heart of the discussion we want to have about fair and proportionate taxation, and about how, particularly in a time of austerity, we can continue to make the vital investments that enable our economy to grow and our public services to deliver the support that all of us rely on. Scotland's tax powers remain limited. More than 60% of Scotland's spending power is still dependent on decisions taken at Westminster. However, it is the case that Scotland now has a greater measure of fiscal control than at any time since the start of devolution. By far the biggest fiscal lever we have is income tax, with 30% of Scotland's budget now coming from income tax receipts. Of course, with that greater ability to levy tax comes a corresponding duty to do so responsibly and in a balanced way, and my government will always do exactly that. In our recent programme for government, I expressed the view that the time is right to consider afresh the role of tax in our budget decisions. And I made a commitment to publish a discussion paper ahead of the draft budget in December. Today we meet that commitment with the publication of this document, The Role of Income Tax in Scotland's Budget. Now, before I talk about the paper in more detail, it's worth reflecting on the financial context and wider backdrop to the decisions that Scotland faces. The UK government has imposed almost a decade of cuts to Scotland's budget. The cut to the Scottish Government's discretionary budget between 2010 and 2020 will amount to £2.9 billion in real terms. As well as continued austerity, we also face the damaging impact of Brexit. Previous analysis indicates that Brexit could cost 80,000 Scottish jobs over a decade, with more than £11 billion a year wiped off our economy by 2030. So there is no doubt that Brexit, coupled with austerity, will make the job of properly funding our public services in the years ahead more difficult. And all of this, of course, comes at a time when an ageing population, which is a good thing, is placing ever greater demands on services like the NHS, social care and housing. Over the past few years, we have worked hard with significant success to balance all of these pressures. Despite cuts to Scotland's budget, we have protected NHS funding, we have shielded local services as best we can, we have continued to invest in the small business bonus and in the infrastructure and business development support that the economy needs. We have mitigated the worst impact of Tory welfare cuts, and we have safeguarded the social contract, delivering public service provision and a range of social benefits that far exceeds what is available anywhere else in the UK. Indeed, it's worth pointing out that the value of university tuition, personal care, prescriptions and eye tests far outweighs the impact of any of the four possible alternative approaches discussed in Chapter 7 of this paper. So I am proud of what we have been able to deliver in the most difficult of circumstances. That progress, though, has involved sacrifices on the part of some, and it is important that we remember that. Our public sector workers, for example, have had years of pay restraint. So as the impact of austerity, Brexit and changing demographics bears down even harder, it is now time to ask ourselves some tough questions. None of us want to see our cherished public services increasingly constrained in what they can deliver. Very few people, if any, will want to see the social contract eroded, with young people having to pay thousands of pounds a year to go to university, or older people having to pay for personal care. And it would not be in the country's best interest to scale back on some of our vital ambitions for the future, like increasing the NHS budget to meet the demand of an ageing population, expanding childcare, giving head teachers more money for our classrooms, extending broadband, building more affordable houses, giving public sector workers a fair pay rise, and investing in the transport infrastructure, research and development and support for entrepreneurs that the economy needs. It is crucial that we protect the next steps in creating that better future for our nation. So with all the pressures we now face, we must consider if the time has come for those who earn the most to pay a modest amount more to enable us to do so. So it is to help aid and inform that discussion that this consultation paper is being published today. The paper explains the composition of the Scottish budget and how it is changing. It looks at the operation of the fiscal framework and sets out our high-level expectations of the UK budget later this month. It provides detail about the income tax base in Scotland, who pays what, and how much each group contributes to the overall budget. It looks at the scale and scope of our income tax powers, the limitations on them, and how they interact with reserve powers. It also sets out some international comparisons. And crucially, indeed in my view most importantly of all, it sets out 4 key tests that we believe any responsible and progressive use of Scotland's tax powers must meet. In line with these tests, any alterations to tax rates will need to firstly maintain and promote the level of public services that the people of Scotland expect. Second, ensure that lowest earning taxpayers are protected and don't see their taxes increase. Third, make the tax system more progressive and reduce inequality. And fourth, together with our corresponding decisions on spending, support the economy. And I believe that these tests reflect the views of the majority of people in Scotland. Namely, we want world-class public services. We shouldn't ask the lowest earners to shoulder more of the burden. We should do all we can to make the system fairer and reduce inequality, and that supporting the economy and sustainable growth should be absolutely central to our approach. This paper analyses and applies these 4 key tests to the tax policies of each of the main parties in last year's Scottish election. And in Chapter 7, it applies these same tests to 4 possible alternative approaches, which consider a range of alterations to both tax rates and tax bands. Now, let me stress that these alternative approaches are not at this stage firm policy proposals. That will come in the budget, nor do they form an exhaustive list. They simply illustrate some of the options open to us. We do, however, believe that the alternatives outlined in Chapter 7 better meet the 4 key tests than any of the parties' manifesto commitments from last year. And they provide a starting point for discussion. Now, we go into these discussions with an open mind and a willingness to listen. But the 4 key tests that we set out today are the criteria that will now guide our decisions. In respect of the first test, all of the alternative proposals in Chapter 7 raise additional revenue for investment in public services and the economy. Indeed, that's also true to varying degrees of all the parties' manifesto proposals, with the exception of the Tories, who would cut money available for public spending. Looking at the second test, all of the 4 alternative approaches at the least protect those earning less than the median income, which is £24,000. Indeed, when the increase to the personal allowance is taken into account, none of these approaches would see anyone earning up to £31,000 pay a penny more than they do now. And in all 4 approaches, more than 70% of all adults would continue to pay no tax at all or no more tax than they do today. All the alternative approaches would also satisfy the third test, and that they would make the tax system more progressive than it is now and help to tackle inequality. The fourth test relates to our duty to support the economy through both our tax and our spending decisions. This government is totally committed to supporting sustainable growth and to giving businesses the best possible opportunity to contribute to that growth. We've delivered substantial savings through initiatives like the Small Business Bonus. We have invested heavily in the infrastructure business needs to thrive, and we've taken a range of actions to support employment. But too often, in my view, the relationship between growth and tax is mischaracterised. Debates about tax become falsely polarised between the needs of the economy on one hand and the needs of our public services on the other. I think that's the wrong approach. The taxes we pay fund the support for business and the economy, as well as our public services. And our competitiveness as a country is about more than just our tax rates. It also depends on the strength of our public services, the skills of our people, and the quality of our infrastructure. Everybody knows that a good society needs a strong economy, but it is equally true that no economy will reach its full potential without a strong, fair, inclusive society. That's the question that should drive this debate and unite us all. That question is, what kind of country do we want Scotland to be? So I hope this paper will help inform that debate. As a government, we will not propose alterations to income tax lightly, but after rigorous, careful and considered discussion, we will bring forward policy proposals that we consider to be in the interests of the country as a whole. My final point is this: in publishing this paper today, I acknowledge that we are a minority administration. That means we must always look to build consensus. If all parties stick doggedly and rigidly to their manifesto positions, our Parliament will not be able to pass a budget, and that would be to fail in our duty to the Scottish people. Today I am making clear our willingness to compromise. I hope other parties will do likewise. And then together we can work to build consensus around a fair and balanced tax policy and a budget that works for everyone in Scotland. I'll now hand over briefly to Derek, who will provide some more of the background and detail of today's publication, and then, given the amount of detail in this paper, we'll both be happy then to answer your questions. Derek.
Thank you, First Minister, and good morning. As the First Minister said, this paper will help inform the discussion with political parties and the wider public as well, Civic Scotland, in terms of the use of our income tax powers, recognising that some 30% of government revenues come from income tax. The paper does describe the limitations, a budget feature, as well as the characteristics of tax and the composition of the Scottish taxpayer base, as well as international comparisons and the wider issues. There is impartial analysis by the Scottish Government's Office of the Chief Economist of the income tax policies of the parties in the Scottish Parliament, and we've been able to model the estimated revenue generated by those policies, as well as the impact on individuals, households and the wider economy. As you'll know, I wrote to all political parties in the Scottish Parliament for inclusion in this discussion paper. The Greens and the Liberal Democrats responded with proposals which have been modelled. The Conservatives didn't respond, and Labour's interim leader did respond, but without firm proposals. But what we have been able to do is model the 2016 Scottish Parliament manifesto positions of those parties who didn't respond. As well as that, as the First Minister said, we've set out alternative approaches which we believe could better meet those tests that the First Minister has set out in terms of promoting and maintaining public services, protecting lower income earners, as well as making the tax system more progressive and supporting economic growth. So it now turns to us to engage with all the parties in Holyrood to make good discussion with Civic Scotland, and I'll do that through roundtable meetings and further engagement, and of course engage with the political parties. The UK Government's budget will be critical in terms of the resources that we have and the relationship with tax as well, and we'll set out our proposition at the Scottish budget. So budget discussions now begin with the other parties. I invite them to engage constructively and positively with us to find that consensus in this Parliament of minorities.
Okay, thanks, Derek. I'm going to take questions. Brian Taylor.
First Minister, Cabinet Secretary, thanks very much for the statements there. I understand that you're keen to stimulate a debate on where the burden should lie, but you're also softening Scotland up for the fact that the burden of income tax is going to increase, and that will scarcely be welcome to those who have to pay that extra cash or to business in order to employ.
Nobody wants to pay more tax, and that indeed is why we have taken such a cautious and responsible approach to tax, and we will continue to do that. But I think everybody across Scotland recognises that we live in quite unprecedented times in terms of the constraints on public spending that, as I said, flows from austerity, the relatively new and, in my view, very unwelcome development of Brexit will significantly worsen our financial challenges in the years to come. And we know, all of us know, that the NHS in particular today faces rising demands from an ageing population, something we should welcome but nevertheless have to deal with the implications of. So I think this is time for a mature, honest, collective discussion about whether it's time to ask those who can most afford to do so to pay a modest, and I stress a modest increase to help us collectively provide the services that we all rely on. And the second point I would make relates specifically to business. Business is an important stakeholder in this debate. As I said in my opening remarks, often this debate is mischaracterised as a debate between business and public services. I announced yesterday extra support for entrepreneurs. We have a big programme of investment in the transport and the digital infrastructure that business needs to thrive. One of our biggest spending commitments in the lifetime of this government has been the small business bonus, taking the business rates burden away from our smallest businesses. So the taxes we pay are important to the environment in which our businesses work in as well. And of course, the competitiveness, the attractiveness of a country comes down to the quality of our public services, the skills of the people we have and the environment that we provide, and that is all important. And the final point I would make here is that because these are such important decisions, I think I've said to you before, tax policy is not a toy. And some of the debate we have heard from some parties over the last year or so have almost sounded as if because we have these powers now, they should be like a toy that we play with because we can. That is not the approach this government will take. That's why these 4 tests that we've set out today are so important, and these tests will guide our decisions. Colin.
First Minister, how much would you have to increase tax, or how much money would you have to raise to meet the inflationary pay rise for public sector workers? Because it doesn't look like any of these options would cover that.
Well, look, there's a range of pressures that we are balancing in the budget, and what we are seeking to do is look at the extent to which a modest increase in tax for those who can most afford it. As I said earlier on, all of the alternative possible approaches we're putting forward here protect the lowest income earners. But we're looking at whether a modest increase for those who can most afford it can help us to balance these pressures. In many respects, we're not going to through income tax. One of the points this paper makes is how limited our tax powers still are. A 5%, and I'm not proposing, incidentally, a 5% increase in income tax, but a 5% increase in income tax because of the fact that income tax makes up only 30% of our budget would only actually increase the Scottish budget by something like 1.5%. So we cannot deal with every pressure we face through income tax, and nor should we try to. But can it make a contribution to trying to ensure that we protect the things that all of us value? We've got higher quality public sector provision in Scotland than any other part of the UK. We've got a broader range of social benefits in Scotland than in the UK. I think we've got better investment in the things that matter to our economy. Of course, one of those pressures is public sector pay, and I have specifically referred to that, but I'm not going to get into negotiations about pay at a press conference. That's one of the issues that we have to confront in the budget ahead, and one of, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why this debate is so important. Peter.
First Minister, you talk in this document talks about potential behavioural changes if you put people's taxes up, which would be that they either change their form of income. Possibly, does it take into account the possibility that people might move? Let's say, for example, from Gretna to Carlisle, the taxes in Scotland are higher.
Well, we have made sure that proper account is taken in all of this analysis of behavioural change. Now, this analysis has been done by the Office of the Chief Economist, not by ministers, and it's important that that modelling is done. It's also important for another practical reason. Our tax estimates are now provided by the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and they will look at behavioural change, and it's their estimates that will determine how much revenue we can budget for in our budget. So if we were simply to ignore that kind of modelling, it wouldn't make any sense. My own view, though, is any tax change potentially leads to behavioural change. That, I think, is common sense. Whether it will do so in reality is another matter, and that's one of the things we will have to monitor very carefully from any tax changes. But, going to your point about the Gretna to Carlisle point, it wouldn't make any sense for anybody, based on any of the proposals in here, to do that, because by moving from Gretna to Carlisle to avoid a modest increase in income tax, you would be making yourself liable for £9,000 a year tuition fees if you've got a university-age child, or making yourself liable to pay personal care when you require care in your older years. You'd have to pay your prescriptions, you'd have to pay for other social benefits that currently in Scotland you don't have to pay for. And that gets to the heart of what I'm saying here. All of the social provision that is in Scotland, that is not anywhere else in the UK, far outweighs any implications of the tax changes that are in this paper. And that is the social provision and the public sector provision that we want to protect, which is why we're having this debate. Seth.
Westminster, you spoke about financial challenges facing this government. Isn't one of the financial challenges that you face funding the election promises that you made, including £500 million extra for the NHS above inflation? And in fact, part of the issue that you're wrestling with is a substantial black hole in your own spending promises.
Well, I don't know anybody, and I literally don't know anybody who would tell me right now that trying to secure above inflation increases for the National Health Service is the wrong thing to do. In fact, I, day in and day out, understandably get met with calls for more spending on the National Health Service. And I say understandably because demand for our health service is outstripping the ability of the health service to meet that demand. And that's true in Scotland, and it's true in many other countries. We put forward proposals. We have to balance our budget, and we will do that in this year as we've done that in every year we've been in government. But it would equally be wrong not to acknowledge the pressures that, in some respects, are pressures that have come about since the Scottish Parliament election. Brexit has come about since the Scottish Parliament election, and while we don't know the precise impact of Brexit, I think every analysis that we see suggests it's going to have quite a profound impact, and one that makes these challenges more difficult. So this is all about having an open, frank and honest debate, not just in Parliament, but with the Scottish people. And going back to Brian Taylor's question, I don't expect that people will celebrate being asked to pay even modest amounts more in tax. But in my experience, with the discussions I have day in and day out with different interests across Scotland, there is now a recognition that if we want to protect the things we value in Scotland and meet these additional ambitions, none of which, the list I read out there, I don't think anybody would argue with the importance of all of these for the future of the country, then we have to have this debate. And I actually think it's to Scotland's credit that, unlike other parts of the UK, we are now going to have that debate in an open and honest way. Hamish.
First Minister, some of the alternatives that you outlined here are fairly complex in terms of changes to the number of bands and so on that are proposed. Has any assessment been done of any costs associated with such a complex change to the tax system? And is Revenue Scotland and the Scottish Government up to doing those changes in the time available?
The HMRC certainly already has the ability to introduce new tax bands for Scotland. Obviously, we have... when we exercise our tax powers, there is a cost to the Scottish Government, whatever we do there in terms of what we have to pay to HMRC, but that is just part of the operation of these tax powers, and obviously we try to minimise these costs, and we'll have discussions with HMRC. But in terms of certainly the four alternative options includes an option that has 3 tax bands just now, one that would have 4, one that would have 5, and one that would have 6 tax bands. Obviously, we'll consider the potential complexity of more bands as one of the considerations in our decisions. But interestingly, the paper draws this out. Many other countries actually have more tax bands than we have in Scotland and the UK right now. So in an international sense, having a system with more tax bands than we have just now, even up to 6, would not be particularly unusual. And actually the evidence says the more tax bands you have, the more progressive your system is, because you're able to gear it much more acutely to the ability of people to pay. But these are issues that we will take into account as we come to our final decisions. Do you want to add anything about the process?
Certainty is really important, and that's why it's good to have this early engagement, so we can set out plans over the course as I say, of the budget, so that there's certainty in advance of the tax year beginning, and of course that would involve engagement with HMRC and of course other tax experts, and that's where the stakeholder engagement will be so important.
Simon.
Question for each Minister, if I may. Mr Mackay, page 8 says that you won't actually know how this has turned out until about 15 months afterwards. If it turns out the economic growth test hasn't been met and it has depressed revenues, will you reverse the changes? And being First Minister, obviously this sets out the context in terms of public finances, but not really so much. There's a little bit about household finances. We have years of real-term pay cuts, inflation going up, pressures of increasing housing costs, petrol costs, whatever Brexit brings for people in terms of the food bills and other consequences of that. What would you say to those households with people earning more than £31,000 who just think, give us a break?
Well, we take these decisions very, very seriously, and we'll reach judgments very carefully for precisely those reasons. That's why in all of the alternative approaches we put forward, we have put great stress on protecting those below median incomes. One of the reasons I don't support the proposals that Labour and the Liberal Democrats in particular have put forward, because they would hit those on the lowest incomes. In terms of people above that, we are talking about modest increases, but I don't underplay the impact of that on household finances. Of course, one of the things that is in our minds at the moment, which all of you know, I've already mentioned it this morning, is public sector pay. And one of the challenges we have to meet is trying to deal with the impact on public sector workers of years of pay restraint. So if this helps us to give fair increases to public sector workers, then the use of some of tax revenue actually has a positive effect on the ability of households to better meet those challenges. But these are issues that no responsible government or First Minister should deal with lightly, and that's why I've, as you know, in the political hurly-burly, been accused by some of my opponents of being cautious on tax. I absolutely have been cautious on tax and will continue to be cautious on tax, because every decision I make on tax is paid for by a household or an individual or a business across the country. So it's right we make these decisions in a careful, responsible and balanced way. I'll pass over to Derek on the issue. We obviously, any government, these are the kind of realities that all governments deal with. We have to monitor the impact of any decisions we make and reflect the findings of that in future budgets. But the reason we will be so careful and set clear tests here is that we want to make sure that we are mitigating any potential downside impact from tax rises in advance, so that we don't deal with the kind of issue that you talk about. Derek?
I think that's the key point, that we're trying to deliver both stability, stimulus and the sustainability of our public services and the social contract as well, and it's all advised by this expert advice and the economists' work, and even looking at IMF work as well around fiscal studies and what budgets can do and progressive tax can do in relationship with economic growth. We'll be guided very much by that, and it's a key test. In terms of the technical detail on page 8, that's back to the block grant adjustment and the relationship with UK tax as well, of course, and that reconciliation is because of the actual tax take compared to what we forecast. So, of course, it will be under review. Of course, we'll take the right decisions with the economy as a key part of that composition.
I know you all, like all of us do, understand the fine detail of the fiscal framework. So, you'll understand that perfectly. David, you're going to explain the fiscal framework to us.
I did enough of that last year. First Minister, can I ask, there's a suspicion among some that the Devolving Income Tax was a bit of a unionist trap, and that they wanted to try and lure you into raising the most unpopular tax, or one of the most unpopular taxes. Are you concerned that that's something that could happen?
Well, I mean, I know you're a conspiracy theorist. I couldn't possibly endorse that view. Look, I think having only one substantial tax lever is not the best position to be in, and I will leave others to speculate on the motives that might or might not be behind the decisions previous UK governments took around this. But there's no doubt that we would be in a different and a better position if we had a wider array and a broader basket of tax powers at our disposal. We don't. We have apart from 2 or 3 much smaller taxes, the key fiscal lever we have is income tax, and that is what we need to have our considerations based on. But it does underline the need, given the nature of income tax, it really underlines the need to be careful and responsible and cautious about this, and that is exactly what we're going to do. Right, a couple more questions. Yes, Tom.
First Minister, there are those who would say that raising income tax sends out a damaging message when it comes to attracting business and fresh talent to come and live in Scotland. I just really wondering what your answer to that would be.
Well, our job is to make sure it doesn't, and to also make the point, that the statement of fact, that even with the sort of implementation of any of the approaches in here, Scotland will remain the most cost-effective part of the UK to be in because of the wider and broader array of social benefits that are available in Scotland. So there is nothing in this paper that would come even close to outweighing the value of tuition fee-free university education or personal care or free prescriptions, the extra investment per head of population that we make in the NHS or other public services. So Scotland will remain not just the part of the UK with the best quality public services, the most generous social provision, but also the most cost-effective part of the UK to live in, and that's a message we will continue to work hard to get across. Okay, 2 more questions and then I have to go to Parliament.
I'm just wondering if it's a foregone conclusion that we will actually get an increase in income tax.
Well, nothing is a foregone conclusion until the budget is not just presented but passed. But you know, I think you can get a sense from this paper today, from what I've said previously, from what I'm saying today, that you know, I think the time was right to consider modest additional contributions to protecting the things we hold dear. But you know, we will go into these budget discussions with an open mind, recognising we are a minority administration. I would stress that point. You know, we have signalled today the willingness to compromise, to move away from fixed positions, and I think it's incumbent on other parties to do likewise. And if we are all prepared to do that, and we are guided by these key tests, not only will we get to the point of being able to pass a budget, we'll pass a budget that is in the best interests of the country, society and economy as a whole. And that is my objective, and that's what we are trying to achieve. Right, who else had their hand up there? Yeah, hi.
You talked about minority government there and needing the backing of other parties to pass through the tax plans in the final budget. The 4 proposals that you've put out are arguably more moderate than what the other parties have put forward. So do you envisage the possibility that you will have to go further than any of those proposals?
We're going into a discussion, and we go into that discussion with open mind, but it sort of relates straight back to my last comment there. You know, we are by far the biggest party in the Scottish Parliament, just short of a majority. So I think it's fair to say our manifesto commitments last year got more support than anybody else's manifesto commitments. But notwithstanding that, we are signalling a willingness and the need to compromise. So to other parties, even although they might think that their proposals are better than ours, they also need to compromise because their manifesto proposals actually got less support than ours did. So nobody can stick rigidly to fixed positions if we want to operate in a way that is putting the country first. And that's what we are determined to do, and that's what all parties need to do if we're going to make progress here. Okay, thank you very much.